and I'll be moderating this webinar. We'll be talking today about the hottest topic in website design for retailers, and that is responsive design. This is a technique for building websites that lets a single site adapt to the size and capabilities of the device the consumer is using. We've got an all-star lineup of speakers. They include Mark Grannan of Forrester Research, an expert in responsive design and other digital experience delivery technologies. Brendan Falkowski, founder of Gravity Department, a strategy and design firm that specializes in e-commerce for a many-device world. Brendan is also a contributor to Magento's Developer Advisory Board. Nigel Aitchison, a director at TTi-Floorcare, who has developed the e-commerce platform for TTi, the supplier of such popular floor cleaning brands as Hoover and Dirtdevil. He recently developed a responsive design site for TTi that's producing a big uplift in mobile sales. And Shannon Parker-Hain, Director of Product Marketing at Magento, the provider of e-commerce technology that is the sponsor of today's webinar. You can ask questions at any time using the question box on your screen, and we'll take them at the end. And you'll all get an email afterwards giving you instructions on how you can access the slides we'll be presenting today. You'll get that email in the next 24 to 48 hours. So let's begin. Responsive design is important because consumers aren't just looking at retail websites on computers, as you all know. They're also very often shopping on tablets and smartphones. How many? 160 million consumers own smartphones, according to ComScore, and 42% of U.S. adults own tablets, according to the Pew Internet Research Center. That translates to 101 million tablet owners. And they shop on those devices. I took data from a Harris poll last week and calculated out how many consumers are shopping on smartphones and tablets. The answer, 32 million on phones, 34 million on tablets. And it's not just about selling to consumers on mobile devices, it's also reaching them. Most of retailers' email, 59%, is now open on smartphones and tablets, according to a report released yesterday by Forrester and Shop.org. In fact, consumers now open marketing emails slightly more often on smartphones than on PCs. That poses a quandary for every retailer selling online. Do you create separate sites for PCs, tablets, and smartphones and make every change to your site 3 times, or do you go to responsive design, adding a new product or promotion just once, and programming the site to display properly depending on the device? In our research for the Mobile 500, which ranks North American retailers and brands by their mobile sales, last year we found 39 of the Mobile 500 had responsive sites. We just about completed with our research for the 2015 edition of Mobile 500, which will be released in September, and the number of Mobile 500 retailers with responsive sites this year is 101. The reason for this growth is simple. It's easier to make a change quickly when you only have to make it once. That's why Hertz, one of the first big companies to adopt responsive design 2 years ago, went that route. Joe Eckroth explained to me last year why he did it, and this quote sums it up. He was the CIO of Hertz when it moved to responsive design, unveiling its first responsive site late in 2012. But here's the bad news. Many responsive sites load slowly, especially on smartphones. Here are the results from a study Keynote did for Internet Retailer this spring, comparing the homepage load time of 12 retail sites built using responsive design techniques. As you can see, on average, the homepage took 18 seconds to load on a smartphone. Not many consumers are going to be around when that page finally does load. And here's one example from one of the retailers studied. You can see how the Sweetwater site renders differently on a PC versus a tablet versus a mobile phone. And the speeds on tablets and PCs are good, but on a smartphone it takes almost 9 seconds for the site to load, and that is too long. So our speakers will explain to you that there are ways to make responsive design work better, and we'll move to them right now. I want to remind you that you can ask questions any time, and we'll take them at the end, and that you will get an email within the next 2 days telling you how to get copies of the slides. With that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Mark Grannan of Forrester Research.
Thanks, Don, and thank you everyone for joining today. Really excited to talk to you about a topic which we've been investing a lot of time and mental energy on, which is responsive web design and how it's an important strategy for those building for a multi-device world. But I wanted to initially follow up and echo one of Don's points. He talked about the overall momentum that mobile is enjoying and the number of devices and the overall willingness to browse and shop on mobile. And this is backed up by our own data, which came out in May. We forecast that by 2018, the United States mobile phone and tablet commerce sales levels will have skyrocketed over 2013. Because in 2013, it represented about $60 to $70 billion in overall commerce sales. By 2018, we expect that number to be close to $300 billion and represent over 50% of all e-commerce. So with that opportunity in mind, we need to start looking at the techniques we can use to deliver and optimize for mobile experiences. So to do that today, we'll look at responsive web design as a strategy, when to choose it, and the pitfalls and best practices that surround those projects. And lastly, how to analyze and measure the value of responsive web design. First, we need to look at the elephant in the room, typically mobile apps. Many customers that we speak with tell us that their customers are more engaged on mobile apps than they are on mobile web. They simply get more attention from their users. And this makes sense because it's an analogy I like to draw with Times Square in New York City. It's hard to replicate, and you can't really pass off that experience anywhere else other than an app store, other than Times Square. But it's expensive, and you're competing for mind share in a very busy visual environment. So it's not necessarily sustainable for all of your mobile initiatives. So with that in mind, we need to look to alternatives. And mobile web is increasingly becoming a good alternative or even better alternative given the business case for your mobile initiatives. And mobile browsers now represent more than 25% of overall web traffic by Akamai's numbers, and that's just up over 7% year on year. So 18% in 2013, 25% in 2014. And those numbers are pretty dramatic for most of the customers we speak with. Many of you on the call today may have already seen 25% and surpassed it a year ago. So these kind of numbers are making mobile web a piece of your overall digital landscape that you can no longer ignore. So with that in mind, we need to build for mobile web. But if we were going to build for each of these device types, desktop, tablet, smartphone, and we were to do that separately, the overall content, complexity of code, and cost to maintain this would spiral quickly out of our reach. So with this level of device fragmentation, with users coming from multiple devices within the same buying cycle, and all these other factors, we need to look at ways to manage and deliver content by building a single experience that can respond and adapt to the device constraints in real time. It simply isn't tenable to move forward with a device-specific approach. So we get to the logical conclusion, why you're all here today, of responsive web. And a good way to understand this, if you don't already understand it, is that with one web experience, you can tailor it to the individual device constraints using device detection. And that allows you to deliver the experience either responsively or adaptively. And while the end user sees very little difference, it will have implications for your design development efforts. What you need to know today at a high level is that responsive means the decision is made on the client side within the browser. It downloads everything and decides then what to render. Or on the server side, whereby device detection tells the server what device is calling, and then you deliver the appropriate modules of content for that device. So now we have a good understanding of responsive web design within the overall context of optimized web. We should understand when to select it. And Forrester decided we need to get past the emotions that surround many enterprise decision-making cycles. I used to maybe be on the desktop team, or you maybe used to be on the mobile team, and we no longer have those silos in place. And making the decision to go responsive could be a question of who is more important in the organization. So you can break down that emotional context with these 7 questions. But I'm going to focus on the top 3 because they actually shape more of the discussion than the bottom 4. So first, how many devices? How many screen breakpoints are you going to support? If you're simply tackling mobile for mobile's sake and you want to leave desktop intact, you could do a mobile-only site and deliver that under a separate URL and a separate code base. And you could even deliver that with some responsive and adaptive techniques built in. But you're not replacing the desktop. So that could be that should be your primary consideration. What are we designing for today based on our mobile users and our overall web traffic needs? Secondly, what is our budget? Because realistically, designing for responsive or designing across multiple device types is more expensive, if for no other reason than the permutations of content will make development and testing efforts longer. And unfortunately, we're still in early days whereby talent pools are limited. So you're no longer able to leverage the same desktop resources for your front-end development efforts that you used to for this responsive efforts. You may have to go outside your 4 walls to a third party like an agency or an SI. And number 3, how complex is a subset of content? If the device, or if your content shares all of the same design parameters already, then you may not need to go responsive because there's less of a need to streamline that experience across device types. However, if that content is relatively complex, you're probably in need of a front-end overhaul anyways, and responsive is a better fit because you're already going to undertake a large web or front-end initiative regardless. And now you can tackle that long tail of mobile devices that have been plaguing you to date. And the bottom 4 are not unimportant, but I want to kind of gloss over them because effectively what you need to do is you need to take a very unemotional approach to deciding whether or not your priorities line up with the strengths of responsive web design. And increasingly, we're hearing from our customers that they are. They absolutely are aligning, and they are deciding to build responsively because mobile and the growth of mobile is just too big to ignore. So let's pretend for a sake that we all just convinced each other that responsive is the way to go and that we're going to set our path on responsive and start to tackle this development project. Well, there's some key pitfalls here and best practices to help us avoid them. And I want to walk you through those, or at least a few examples. But first, we need a framework. Rather than walking through this one by one, let's look at this holistically. And Forrester's idea cycle is a framework to do just that. It was developed by my colleagues who recently released a book called The Mobile Mind Shift, and it spawned a stream of research here for Forrester clients. But essentially what it allows us to do, it allows us to break down our development priorities in 4 key steps: identify, design, engineer, and analyze. And while this was specifically designed to tackle mobile, it is also perfectly acceptable to look at this for responsive web design, even if it includes desktop. And I'll come back to this cycle in just a moment, but I want to acknowledge one other thing before we get started that should be at the forefront of your conversations when you step into a responsive project, and that these development project barriers, these 6 items here on the screen, from disagreements over context and content priorities all the way through immature tooling, those are barriers that you as a project lead or maybe your colleagues on the technical side of the house will be facing, but they won't necessarily be in line with the business's success requirements. And if you can align the technical priorities with the business's success requirements up front, you can potentially mitigate a lot of issues. We spoke with one client who, as a technology vendor, they were brought in at the very last minute to mitigate a really big issue with their client. The client had rolled out the responsive site, and they saw conversion rates plummet, absolutely fall off a cliff. And that is a nightmare scenario for any retailer because responsive web design is hard, and you will work at it for 6 or 9 months potentially before rolling out the site. And then only to see your business metrics not reflect that effort would be a true tragedy. So aligning against these requirements and project barriers from the outset will help you get to success for all of your stakeholders. So back to the idea cycle. The idea cycle will actually allow us to initially tackle some of these pitfalls. During the identify stage, not only will you be looking at mobile traffic parameters and creating device priority lists and looking at content, you also need to understand what's been slowing you down to date. Leveraging best practices where possible to accelerate your project. And I chose this picture of barnacles on a boat propeller because when you start to look at your overall information architecture and content strategy, it's very likely that you'll find content that has no real relevance in your new responsive web design environment. And if you can do what the director of a digital media practice at a financial services firm we interviewed did, you could potentially gain the same benefits of paring down your content from 20,000 pages across 4 languages down to 8. And that content audit, that information architecture investigation to streamline their content and move forward for responsive actually allowed their overall web practice to move faster going forward in the same way removing barnacles off the bottom of the boat would allow you to move faster. And that's just one best practice amongst many to help during the identify phase, but I think it's critical for those of you who are taking your content in mass and moving it to a new front end. It actually would behoove you to look at your content up front before the project gets underway, or maybe in parallel with some of the other requirements gathering to help you move faster down the road. Now second, during the design phase, there are many barriers here, not to mention skill sets and other things we've mentioned already, but one key barrier I wanted to call out here is the fact that your design teams are not necessarily on the same page as your development teams. And you can bridge this gap to make that communication smoother, and you should, because it'll allow you to accelerate through this phase and come out with a more quality result on the other end. And this is due to the fact that your designers may have been developing static PDFs to throw over the wall for the development team to build out, and that doesn't bring design intent with it, especially if the design is meant to fluidly flex, adapt, or respond to the device types. So there are some tools out there or frameworks that your teams can collaborate with and allow them to move through that design development cycle faster with better results. And one of the CEOs, one of these products that we spoke with, told us their client, their enterprise client, moved from a 3-month design development cycle to 2 weeks. And that kind of time savings will have dramatic impacts on your ability to tackle the long tail of testing requirements or other requirements down the road and give you that kind of slack that you'll need to make sure that the site is performing well and will meet your business's requirements. And again, just one best practice out of many. Third, during the engineering phase of the idea cycle, many folks underestimate the long tail of requirements. And I chose an iceberg here because for those of us who remember this lesson back in grade school, 90% of the mass of an iceberg sits below the waterline. And similar for that, mobile carries a lot of baggage with it that can impact your overall engineering requirements, because your existing systems, your content management systems, or your underlying data management solutions, your web architectures, your network architectures may not be up to the task of scaling towards mobile requirements, and specifically for speed. And Don called this out really well earlier. Look how slow this site's loading on mobile, 18 seconds. No way anyone's sticking around for that. Well, that is a scary story, but realistically you can solve for some of those performance issues proactively. First, test. Test and monitor your current state before you even begin responsively. So you can create a benchmark or baseline to compare the new site against and test against as you move forward, so that when the new site does roll out and it may feel slower, you can point back to raw numbers and make sure that your business isn't reacting to something that's more of an emotion rather than an actual data point. 2, there are some real techniques here when you're developing front-end code, front-end optimization techniques that allow you to optimize for mobile. Essentially, mobile has a smaller screen size, therefore there's less content that would give the appearance of the site having fully downloaded and rendered. If you can prioritize that on-screen or above-the-fold content, you can give the illusion of performance. Second, right-size images. And I can't emphasize this point enough. Images make up the vast bulk of web experiences to date. Because we're delivering for Retina displays on MacBook Pros or what have you, that is punishing the mobile user experience because it's forcing them to download really high-resolution images even though the user has no chance of benefiting from that really high-res image. So if you can use server-side techniques to render the image in real time, or if you can use server-side techniques to deliver a different version of the same image, you'll help lighten that overall payload for the end user. And then last, compress the code. Make your end users make fewer round trips back to the server. That reduces latency, and it also reduces server load so that your systems can meet those needs with less strain. So those 3 pieces constitute what we call, and what the industry calls, FEO, or front-end optimization techniques. But they aren't the only 3 techniques. There are many others here, and you can have those ongoing performance conversations with many other stakeholders. Your designers can use open web fonts as opposed to custom fonts. Your application architects can identify potential application call bottlenecks within your overall architecture. Your network engineers can make sure that they're not doing any kind of traffic management that would undermine your performance on mobile. And your third-party acceleration service providers like CDNs can do these FEO techniques in conjunction with caching and other performance techniques to make sure that the site performs as fast as possible. And lastly, if you're in the technology side of the house at your organization and you're saying there's no way I have budget for this, well, good news, your colleagues in e-commerce, your colleagues in marketing actually have direct reporting structures about these business KPIs. So if the site isn't performing, they're going to pay for it. They're going to hear about it. So fund it with their budget and bring them in on those performance conversations. So now that we've solved for engineering, or at least one of the issues around mobile engineering, which is site acceleration, we can get to our final step of the idea cycle, which is analyze. And a lot of people are looking at, well, we need to know about this first so we can build the business case. So I want to identify a few of the metrics you might be able to look at. You'll be able to look at the metrics and the business value metrics that relate to specific page functionality. So depending on the scope of your overall development or responsive web development, you can start looking at increased site traffic. You can look at average order size if you're a retailer. You can look at reducing shopping cart abandonment rates or reducing bounce rates. And you can attribute it to that specific functionality. And therefore, you can justify the investment in those areas of your site. But that's a very developer-centric view of how do we tie page functionality to business metrics. A better way is actually to leverage our framework. Forrester has a mobile measurement framework that tackles this whole issue holistically. And you start with technical, and you move to engagement, and then business metrics. And what this allows you to do is allows you to tell a story over time that appeals to not only technical folks, but also your CX and UI people, and also your business stakeholders. And you are able to tell a story that's important and relevant to each of them in turn. So by looking at your bounce rates in context with the overall device stats and crashes, and then looking downstream to your upsell and revenue, you're telling a holistic or end-to-end story. And this is obviously part of an overall iteration in your web strategy. So we want to acknowledge that. Many of you won't build your entire site responsively right out of the gate. You'll need to use early wins to gain support for future projects. Razorfish, an agency, a large agency in the US, told us about one of their clients who, even though they're in the enterprise manufacturing space with no real direct KPIs attributed to their responsive site, they were able to reduce their cycle times, their campaign cycle times, from 6 weeks to 4 after pivoting to responsive, which is a 33% decrease, which was very significant for them. It saved them time and it made them more relevant when they got to market. And armed with that win, they were able to get the ear of their C-suite and maintain further investment in their digital marketing capabilities. And for the retailers on the line, absolutely call out those direct business metric wins. Gorilla, another agency we spoke with, told us about their client, 511 Tactical, and their metrics saw such a dramatic uptick, they even agreed to share them here today. Their sessions and visits increased almost 200% on mobile. Their revenue on mobile increased over 200%, and their conversion rate increased almost 50%. And while there is a caveat here, they only built responsively for mobile because they weren't yet ready to retire their desktop site. This is potentially enough of an impetus to get their business leaders on board with responsive. They could then soon retire the desktop site, and the whole organization can then move faster and make changes faster across web channels. So with that, I thank you, and I hope you've been putting some questions into the chat window. Looking forward to tackling those at the end. But right now, I want to hand off to Brendan Falkowski from Gravity Department. He's here to share some of his recommendations based on his experience building sites for online retailers and merchants.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm Brendan Falkowski. I'm an independent design consultant, and for the last 3 years, I've specialized in responsive design for e-commerce. I regularly speak about my work for clients like Skinny Ties and Angry Birds and eBay and Magento. And currently, I'm working with a $4 billion B2B industrial supply company on a responsive design. And I'm also building a framework for Magento Enterprise called Mage Frontend. The biggest problem that I see when companies approach responsive design incorrectly is trying to squeeze their current desktop site into a mobile form factor. Mobile first is a methodology that asks you to design interactions by thinking of what happens on the smallest screen first. This forces you to prioritize the critical information and interactions before you think about layout and other things that aren't really available to you when there's only 6 square inches to work with. And then you let that hierarchy and priority define the site's structure. The companies that really struggle with mobile-first thinking are often led astray by either their own M.dot site or one they've seen from a competitor. And if you're only viewing mobile as this stripped-down experience, then it's going to be hard for you to visualize how a user's experience on the site needs to scale across the form factor of many different sized devices. The best way to reframe this that I found is by asking on those M.dot sites, what makes a user click the View Full Site link in the footer? Because that's effectively a vote from them that the stripped-down mobile version isn't working for their needs. It's not helping them. And it's especially obvious when a responsive site was designed desktop first, because everything from the header is crammed into just the narrowest layout. And that typically leaves no room for actual content on the page. Now, like in this example, you might not notice this when viewing 2 responsive sites on a tablet, because they tend to look pretty good at a desktop size. But it's more obvious when you see the same sites on a phone. A short exercise defining what the most important interactions for the store are can help you organize the mobile view more efficiently. So in this case, it's navigation to categories, the cart, accessing my account, and search. And then you can scale that up to a cleaner site on a large screen. You don't have to sacrifice the utility or depth in either view to create a winning experience. Karen McGrain's a leading content strategist who's really has a wonderful description of responsive design as planning for your content to go everywhere. There's a full spectrum of devices, and the user is the one that decides which to use. It's not really your decision as a maker of the site. Building for the broadest support possible is the smartest strategy. So nobody who's shopping your site to see how well it adapts across devices, they just kind of expect that to happen seamlessly today. They're shopping with you because you have a product they want, you have information about it, and your services are valuable. And today, 34% of cellular internet users in America rely on their phone as their primary way to access the web, meaning a laptop or a desktop or a tablet are either secondary devices for them, or they simply don't have access to them at all. People that are young or non-white or lower income or lower in education level are disproportionately part of this group, but it's a big potential makeup of your customers, so you shouldn't be ignoring them by only building for bigger screens. And this makes it increasingly important that you don't cut content or features in order to launch faster or to avoid difficult decisions. Not only is this going to hurt a large percentage of your users, but it's also going to make your multi-device users more frustrated. Nearly 2/3 of online shoppers today have started their transaction on one device and finished it on another. Users today have the expectation that they'll be able to perform any action from whatever device they're holding. This means filtering their search results, reading reviews, saving wish lists, and checking out all need to be universally accessible. And it's really not too complicated to build a consistent experience if you plan for it from the start. But it does take consideration up front to prioritize those functions and that information. In the case of skinny ties, we chose to drastically increase the complexity of their taxonomy by mapping every attribute about their ties to a standardized format. Now, beforehand, users could only navigate a rigid category tree based on tie width. But this dynamic taxonomy helped us build multiple entryways to every product. And the linchpin in this taxonomy is that it's accessible from every type of product list on every device. If you browse by new ties, you can find just the wool ones. And if you search for 2-inch ties, you can narrow down to striped ties with blue accents. It would have been really easy for us to say filtering is just too complex for phones, and then only provide category navigation. But that wouldn't have lined up with how our users shop and think. And we knew that was true from analyzing the search terms they used and designing the taxonomy around those dynamic attributes, and hence designing their experience of shopping on the site that way. Now, redesigns like this aren't really launched in a structure that provides good material for case studies. We kind of just put the whole thing out there in one go. But the combination of responsive design and this flexible taxonomy contributed to a really massive boost in their revenue, in their SEO value, and their conversion rates across every platform and form factor. It would be really extremely difficult to manufacture this kind of impact with any other marketing strategies. And the best part for them is that it's been sustained. They keep earning new customers because everyone that shops on the site has such a good experience, regardless of what device they're using, that they recommend it to their friends. And I mentioned at the beginning that I've done a lot of speaking about responsive design and e-commerce over the last few years. My talks build on each other, so they're a really good primer on the options, pitfalls, and decision-making that goes into responsive implementations, both at a technical and a business level. There's not enough time today, but I hope you'll check them out if this is something your company is weighing the options for. Thanks for listening, and now I'll hand off to Nigel Aitchison from TTi-Floorcare.
Thank you, Brendan. Good morning. I'm Nigel Aitchison, and I work for TTi-Floorcare as their IS Director for EMEA. For those of you that don't know, TTi are a group that have two main divisions: Power Tools with brands like Milwaukee and Ryobi, and Floorcare, where in the US our main brand is Hoover, in Europe it's Dirtdevil, and in the UK Vax, where we are currently the UK's best-selling floor care brand. I've been asked to speak today as we recently completed a responsive site using Magento 1.14 Enterprise Edition, and we had some amazing results that I'm happy to share with you. So at Vax, we have our main site, which is vax.co.uk, which is built on Magento's enterprise platform, and we had tried a number of mobile solutions as the traffic to the site had shown that we were getting more and more tablet and mobile users. And I'm afraid to say that our first few attempts were a complete disaster, with conversion rates dropping, even though we thought we'd got it right by having a separate mobile site, m.vax.co.uk. It just didn't work. So we then decided to look at responsive, and were about to embark on what would have been quite a costly project to redesign Vax for responsive, when luckily for us Magento launched 1.14 with its responsive design. It took us about half a day to mock up a responsive site to test the functionality and see whether it was delivering gains that we thought we would want to have. We have, in the UK, we have something called a yard sale, where I think in the US they're called fire sales. And what we do is we launch a site for 5 days with keenly priced products that we want to shift from our warehouse. This might be because we've got damaged boxes or overstock, etc. And alongside with a social media and email campaigns. These have proven to be extremely effective for us. And we decided that instead of converting vax.co.uk at the start, we would test the upcoming yard sale site with the Magento 1.14. And we've got a few pictures of how the site looked. So this is the site looking on a desktop, and then we go through to a tablet. And if somebody would like to click next screen, yep. So that's a tablet screen, and then we go through to on the phone. And the last slide is on the checkout, keeping it nice and clean. We managed to complete this build and testing within 4 weeks. And this also included adding PayPal to the checkout options and some other customer experience changes that we wanted to make. One of the things that we had to do with the site is test it. It's extremely popular, and we aimed for the following, which is 10,000 concurrent users on the site with a sub 3-second page response time. During the last sale, we hit over 1,000 concurrent users for over 18 hours on the first day. During the sale, that number of concurrent users didn't go below 500. I've got to admit, I have always wondered what people were doing in the early hours. I now know, buying vacuum cleaners. So what were the results that we had? Well, to share some history, one of our other sales in December, which was exactly the same, so a yard sale, but was not responsive or mobile, we had a conversion rate on mobile of 2.78%, on tablets of 7.84. I think, as you can see there, the responsive site blew those figures away. Mobile conversion of over 7% and a tablet of over 11%. Even our desktop conversion increased by over 3%. We do believe that by going and using the Magento responsive theme, PayPal, and adjusting our basket to be more streamlined gave us these leaps and resulted in a record for us of well over 1 million sterling during the 5 days, with approximately 25% of that going via PayPal. So what would be my recommendations if you're going to go down this route? It's amazing how different the sites look from having an HTC phone to a Galaxy to an iPhone. And whilst there are a number of good testing tools, nothing beats testing it with the real thing. So look at your analytics, see what devices people are using, and then go out and buy them. Testing responsive takes a lot longer, so allow more time. Payment options that allow near one click and remove the need to hold a phone in one hand, a credit card in another, and entering details via your nose should be used. Make the payment as simple as possible for people. Load testing is an absolute must. When we first did it, the server failed at 100 users. We now get close to 2,000 users per server, and by the end of the year, we're aiming for over 5,000. Reduce the amount of product you have on the site. If you've got too many things which are similar, it just turns people off. Site speed. Always think about speed. It's amazing what testing can do, as some of the previous presenters have said. Look at what's happening on your site at the start. Reducing image quality will speed the site up. We had a problem that most of our designers were normally designing for boxes or for posters, and they didn't comprehend that you don't need gigabit files for having on a mobile device. In summary for us, responsive has worked a treat, and we're now going to be moving on and converting vax.co.uk as quickly as we can. But it is only part of a journey that e-commerce sites, I think, must now take to maximize the revenue and improve customer experiences. So I'd like to thank you for listening to me, and I will now hand over to Shannon.
Shannon, we're not hearing you. Are you muted?
So I am. Hi. Thanks, Nigel and everyone. This is Shannon Parker-Hain, and I head up inbound product marketing for Magento, the sponsor of today's webinar. I'm going to take just a few minutes to tell you about the Magento platform and how we're helping merchants like Nigel create responsive e-commerce sites. Let's start with just a little bit of background on Magento. If you look at the Internet Retailer Top 500, Magento is the #1 e-commerce platform for mid-market merchants. And by mid-market, I mean businesses with online sales of 20 million to 75 million. It's also the e-commerce platform of choice for great brands like Alex and Ani, Spanx, and Ice. What's driving this momentum in the mid-market? Well, you know, we're finding that merchants are realizing that Magento can help them succeed and grow by giving them greater control. Magento empowers them to run their businesses their way by delivering unsurpassed flexibility through full source code control. It also offers some other great benefits, including high performance and a proven ability to scale as your business grows, an extensive out-of-the-box feature set, which delivers great value for the money and the most compelling total cost of ownership in the market. We also have a global network of service and technology partners that merchants can work with to bring their visions to life. And we also, of course, provide access to the technology and know-how of eBay, a global commerce leader who will never compete with them. Relevant for our discussion today, Magento is also a leading platform for merchants who want to pursue a responsive design strategy. In fact, 32% of responsive e-commerce sites in the Alexa 1 million are on the Magento platform, which is more than any other vendor. And as Nigel mentioned, we just recently released a responsive design reference theme that merchants can use to accelerate the development of responsive sites. The theme is full-featured and built using modern technologies with input from responsive experts like Brendan, who spoke earlier today, to ensure that it meets merchant needs. And what we've heard so far from merchants who have used the reference theme, like Shop3M, which is in the screenshot in this slide, is that it's enabled them to get to market significantly faster and with good results. So if you're interested in a full-featured, affordable, and responsive-friendly solution, we encourage you to learn more about Magento by going to our website, magento.com. You can also find some information there about our responsive reference theme as well. Thanks for attending today's webinar, and now I'm going to turn things back to Don for the Q&A session.
Okay, thanks, Shannon. Well, a lot of great content. We've got quite a few questions already in the queue, but you still have time to ask. Remember that you all will get an email before the end of the week explaining how you get access to the slides. So let's go right to the questions. First question, it seems to me that content has to be reduced using mobile compared to desktop. Would you agree? Brendan, why don't you start with, take that one first. Brendan, are you muted?
Sorry, I was muted.
I'm sorry, okay, go ahead.
I'd probably disagree with that. Yeah, if you're going to produce content and it's useful to users, I don't think that's going to be different regarding their mobile or home context. If the only reason you want to pare it down is to make it fit, then I think you need to look at layout transformations to make that happen, or start to question whether that content's actually valuable.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in on that real quick?
So this is Mark. I would echo that comment. We've heard from multiple enterprise clients, and while that might be a little bit of a bigger scale in terms of complexity over the mid-market, we see that if they do launch initially with a limited subset of content, they're only kicking the can down the road. That by delaying that, they're actually doing themselves a disservice because they didn't build their information architecture and their navigation settings with the full breadth of content in mind. So even if you can't deliver all of the initial content on the initial release, I would say do that strategy work around your content and your navigation structure and some of that those other considerations up front regardless.
Okay, here's a question for you, Mark. Would you recommend the responsive approach or the adaptive approach?
Good question. I would say it depends. I would say manage the content responsively as much as possible. And if you need to leverage adaptive delivery techniques to make sure you hit your performance thresholds, then absolutely do it. Then you'll kind of get the benefit of both worlds. The adaptive delivery piece specifically might, at least initially, seem difficult. But as I mentioned, there are third-party services out there that can help you make some of those rendering decisions server-side without any sort of extra engineering effort. So I wouldn't shy away from it just because it sounds complex.
Okay. Brendan, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I pretty much agree with that down the road.
Okay. And a related question for you, Nigel, is the Vax website responsive or adaptive?
Currently, vax.co.uk is just a standard desktop website. We're now moving towards making it a responsive site. The yard sale site was both, so we leveraged the use of CDNs and we used the responsive site. It's a matter of finding the way to deliver the right amount of speed without losing other bits and pieces. So it's a case of trying to deliver the full functionality to all the platforms at the same time.
Okay. And one of our listeners says, you've got such amazing results with the Vax site. Why is it still not in production?
The yard sale site was effectively us putting a toe in the water to see whether we'd get the results that we looked for, and we certainly did. So we now have a number of projects which are all to do with customer experience and the journey with the Vax site. So the main Vax site, probably within the next couple of months, will be converted to a fully responsive site. It's just that we've got so many things we're trying to do with that site, and I think a lot of people will also find that sites are no longer now just about e-commerce. You're also trying to do correct levels of support and other types of customer engagement, and it's making sure that you convert those at the same time. So it isn't just about having e-commerce as responsive, it's about having your entire support and contact points for the customers being responsive. So it's time for us, really.
Okay. A question for you, Mark, and others may have opinions on this. Do you recommend removing videos and PDF files from the mobile version of a website to improve the load time?
Well, I think kind of similar to how we discussed earlier, I wouldn't recommend removing the content altogether. I would potentially recommend delaying the loading. So you can use lazy loading techniques, or at least you can give them an initial thumbnail image, the user, thumbnail image and then allow them to initiate the download separately or independent of the page render. But I would not recommend removing critical content which you feel is important for that experience.
Okay. Question for Brendan. Would you recommend using the new responsive theme that Magento has packaged with the Magento software, or would you recommend for a small to mid-sized business building one from scratch?
That's really going to depend on what your goals are and what your budget is for the project, really. I think the responsive theme that's bundled with Magento 1.9 and 1.14 is a really great starting point. If, like with TTi-Floorcare, you're just testing the waters and you want to see how something works quickly. Nigel mentioned if they got their site up within a month, that's a relatively small investment compared to building out from scratch, which, you know, in my cases usually takes about 8 months to go through the full cycle, from planning to design to implementation, testing, and then launch. If you are sure from a company and business perspective that that's a route you're going to take, I don't see any problem with it. I've never had a bad result come out of it. But it's really about knowing what your resources and timeline is.
Okay. Question for Mark. Are there standard resolutions and other specifications for the platforms we've been talking about, PC, smartphone, and tablet? I think the question may be getting on the fact that these devices, of course, are all changing in their size. What kind of resolutions should a retailer work with?
So I think it kind of depends on the demographic of the customers who are coming to your site, but traditionally it's sticking with the largest device categories out there, and if you're talking about buyers on mobile devices in the US specifically, you're probably going to rely on Apple as your fallback. So native resolutions for a 4-inch screen on an iPhone and 8-inch screen on an iPad, and potentially a high-resolution desktop experience that can support that 1080 experience. So I would certainly look at your web logs to just see what traffic consists of in terms of the different device types. But those are the 3 typical use cases of smartphone, tablet, and desktop. But potentially you could even blur some lines because, as you just said, the device categories themselves are somewhat blurring because you'll have 6-inch phones and 7-inch tablets. I mean, so the line becomes somewhat arbitrary at that point. But you will need to make breakpoint decisions so that the content can reflow and be optimized for that range of sizes.
And I would just add on to that, that if you are thinking about where those breakpoints belong, I would try not to orient them to devices that are in the marketplace today, because they're not going to be there in a year or two. I would root all your design decisions in the shape and volume of your content. That's really going to be a much more instructive way to build your sites out. And then it really doesn't matter what device that a person uses to access it, as long as you're fitting the design to the content you have in place, it's going to feel appropriate on that shaped device.
Okay, here's a question, Brandon, seems related to your example, the skinny ties example you gave with the filters. The questioner asked if the mobile version should use filters more often than desktops to navigate to selected content.
I wouldn't say it should be more often. I would want them to have an equivalent experience. The main reason being that if I start shopping on a phone and decide not to complete my purchase, I want them to be able to switch to a desktop and recreate that journey in the same flow, if they can't just directly pick up their transaction on another device. If you were to say, take those filters out in one part of an experience, then you're definitely going to lose the customer at that point.
Okay, a question for you, Nigel. What checkout system did you use on the Vax site?
We started with the standard Magento one and basically have crafted it internally. So we haven't downloaded any plugins or anything else. We've effectively built it ourselves. But the starting point was the standard Magento one.
Okay. Question for Mark, and others may have other opinions as well. Are there good ways of dealing with images as a busy image that will work on a large scale on desktop or tablet won't work when scaled down for a mobile device, mobile phone?
Sure, there are certainly third-party
focal points.
Yeah, I think your digital asset management solution perhaps can even tackle some of this. If by chance you're an Adobe Scene 7 customer, it can tackle this refocusing or focal point issue. There are also third-party image rendering services that can not only handle the image transcoding, but also allow your marketers to highlight the image and how it will scale on and refocus on different device types. So there certainly are commercial options out there, but they do take extra effort and investment to make that happen.
Okay.
And you can also do this natively through the picture element, which is just become an HTML5 spec that allows you to specify multiple image sources for one asset. So if you wanted to design one version of a banner, for example, on a small screen, and then a separate version on a big screen, you'd serve the correct asset to the correct device using native browser tools. So you have options to do it that way too.
Yeah, absolutely. Those adaptive delivery techniques can clearly step in and save you here, as opposed to potentially making other investments. So yeah, good point, Brennan.
And good for performance. All those commercial or non-commercial, that's really the underlying thought there, is you don't want to load all the images but only show one of them.
Absolutely.
And this will be our last question, but how would you recommend rolling out a responsive design site, for example, to a certain percentage of the audience? Brendan or perhaps Nigel could talk about his own experience.
Well, obviously do it as carefully as possible. I mean, having a load balancer up front so you can direct a certain percentage, and then you can gradually see how the site performs and the server performs. So I'd definitely recommend having something like a load balancer in the front, and then just gradually bringing it up. And you can always then just swap over when you feel the site is performing as you want it to.
One of the things that we've done in the B2B space is roll out a beta version of the site and invite some of our clients into it, so they can have real customers test it out and provide feedback, what's working and what's not working for them, before we launch it to all of their customers.
Okay, I'm afraid our time's up. It's been a good discussion. There's obviously a lot more to talk about. You will all get access to the slides. You can study them, and also a link to today's presentation. I want to thank again Mark Grannan of Forrester Research, Brendan Falkowski of Gravity Department, Nigel Aitchison of TTi-Floorcare, and Shannon Parker-Hain of Magento. And thank you all for attending. Have a great day.